In a quiet village surrounded by tall grass and ancient trees lived a young woman named Amara. She was 20 years old and had deep brown skin, long black braids that reached her waist, and kind eyes that always looked as if they carried a hidden sadness. She lived with her mother in a small mud house near the river and spent her days selling fruits in the market. People loved her because she was gentle and never refused to help anyone. One cold morning, her mother became very ill and passed away before sunset. Amara buried her with her own hands and sat beside the grave until the moon rose. She did not know that her life would become longer than anyone could imagine. 5 years passed after her mother's death, and the people who grew up with Amara slowly began to change. Their faces became older, and some already had children running around the village. Yet Amara looked exactly the same as the day she buried her mother. At first nobody noticed because she was still young, but an old woman selling vegetables stared at her one afternoon and said she had not changed at all. The word spread across the village like smoke. Some people laughed and said it was only good fortune, while others watched her with strange eyes. Amara looked into the river that evening and saw the same young face staring back at her. For the first time, fear entered her heart. Another 15 years passed, and the children who once played around Amara's house had become grown men and women. They now had children of their own, yet Amara still looked 20 years old. People no longer called her by her name. They began calling her the woman who never changed. Children pointed at her in the market, and visitors came from other villages just to see her face. Every day became harder for Amara because she could no longer explain why time refused to touch her. She stopped attending celebrations and spent most of her evenings sitting alone outside her house, listening to the sound of insects and wondering if she would ever become old like everyone else. One rainy season, the village chief who had known Amara since she was a child became very weak. Before he died, he called her to his bedside. He held her hand with his shaking fingers and looked at her with tears in his eyes. He said he had watched her for many years and had never seen a single line appear on her face. Then he whispered that living forever among people who grow old must be a painful burden. Those words remained in Amara's mind long after he was gone. At his funeral, she stood under the rain while everyone cried, and she suddenly realized that she had already begun to outlive the people who remembered her childhood. 50 years had passed since the day her mother died. The village had changed completely. New houses stood where forests once grew, and old paths had become busy roads. Nobody alive remembered Amara as a little girl anymore. They only knew her as the strange young woman who never became old. She walked through the market and saw faces she had never seen before, heard songs she had never heard before, and realized she had become a stranger in the very place where she was born. That night she returned to her mother's grave and cried harder than she ever had before because she could barely remember the sound of her mother's voice. She feared that one day even her memories would grow old and disappear while she remained exactly the same. One afternoon, while walking through the market, Amara met a little girl carrying a basket that was almost too heavy for her small hands. The child smiled at her and offered her a ripe mango without asking for anything in return. Nobody had shown Amara such simple kindness in many years. She sat under a tree with the girl and listened to her talk about dreams, family, and the future. For hours, Amara forgot her loneliness and laughed again. But as the sun went down, a terrible thought entered her heart. The child beside her would one day grow old, become weak, and leave this world, while she would remain exactly the same. The happiness she felt suddenly turned into fear, and she silently wished she had never accepted the mango. Years moved like the river after heavy rain. The little girl became a young woman, then a wife, and later a mother with children of her own. Every few years she visited Amara and brought food, and the two of them would sit together and remember the old days. Slowly, lines appeared on the woman's face and silver entered her hair, but Amara remained unchanged. People in the town began to whisper once again. They wondered how it was possible that one friend could become old while the other stayed forever young. Amora tried not to think about it, yet every visit became more painful because she could clearly see time carrying her dear friend farther and farther away. One cold evening, the woman who had once been that little girl became very ill. Amora sat beside her bed and held her hand through the night. The old woman looked at her and smiled gently. She said that since childhood she had never seen a single change on Amora's face and often wondered if carrying the same young face for so long was a blessing or a curse. Then she whispered that she wished they could have grown old together. Those words cut deeply into Amora's heart. Before sunrise the old woman closed her eyes forever, and Amora sat there alone, unable to stop crying. After the funeral, Amora stopped speaking to most people. She no longer visited the market and no longer sat with families during celebrations. She feared becoming close to anyone because every friendship ended in the same painful way. She would stay young while the other person slowly disappeared. At night she walked to the river and sat on the same stone where her mother once washed clothes. The water moved quietly through the darkness, and she wondered how many more people she would bury before her own life finally ended. For the first time, she began to feel tired of being alive. 100 years had passed since Amora's birth. The small village where she had grown up had become a busy town filled with new faces and new voices. Nobody remembered her parents, her childhood, or the small house where she once lived. To everyone, she was simply the young woman who never changed. Travelers came from distant places just to look at her, and some even asked to touch her hand because they believed she carried a great secret. Yet none of them understood her sadness. They saw only a beautiful young face, but inside Amora carried the grief of an entire century. Many more years passed, and the town continued to grow around Amora. Small huts became large buildings, new roads appeared, and people from distant places settled there and raised families. Amora watched generation after generation arrive and disappear like waves on the river. Sometimes she would sit outside her house and remember the faces of people who had once filled her life. She remembered her mother, the old chief, and the little girl who had shared a mango with her. Their voices were becoming faint in her memory, and that frightened her more than loneliness itself. She realized that she was not only losing people, she was slowly losing the memories of them too, and she feared that one day she would remember nobody at all. One morning, a young traveler came to the town and stopped when he saw Amora sitting beneath a tree. He had heard stories about a woman who never grew old and had journeyed for many days just to see her with his own eyes. He sat beside her and asked what it felt like to live for so long. Amora could not answer immediately because nobody had ever asked her that question before. After a long silence, she finally said that every extra year felt like carrying another stone inside her heart. The traveler looked surprised because he had imagined her life to be wonderful. He did not understand that watching everyone leave while you remain behind can become the deepest kind of sadness. The traveler visited Amora every day for several months. They spoke about old memories, changing times, and the many places he wished to see. For the first time in decades, Amora began to smile again. She found herself waiting for his footsteps every morning and listening carefully to every story he told. But deep inside, she was afraid to let herself become happy because she already knew how every friendship in her life ended. One evening, while the sun disappeared behind the hills, she looked at him and realized that he too would one day become old while she remained exactly the same. The thought made her eyes fill with tears even though nothing bad had happened yet. The years passed as quietly as falling leaves. The traveler became an older man, his hair slowly turning gray and his hands becoming rough and weak. Yet Amora remained exactly as she had been the day they met. People often stopped and stared at them because they looked like a father and daughter even though they had once been the same age. The old man would laugh at the strange looks, but Amora never laughed. Every new wrinkle on his face reminded her that another goodbye was coming. She tried to spend every possible moment with him because she knew time was carrying him away little by little. One cold season, the old traveler became too weak to walk. Amora stayed beside him every day, bringing him food and telling him stories from the distant past. One evening he looked at her with tired eyes and asked her to promise that she would never stop living, no matter how long her journey became. Then he smiled and said that meeting her had been the greatest part of his life. Before sunrise, he quietly passed away while holding her hand. Amora sat beside him for hours, unable to move. When she finally stepped outside, she realized that she had once again become the only person left carrying memories that nobody else remembered. After the old traveler died, Amora did not return to her house for many days. She wandered through the town with no destination, walking along roads that had once been narrow paths when she was a child. Everywhere she looked, she saw things that reminded her of people who no longer existed. A tree where she once sat with her mother had grown so large that its branches covered half the road. A small stream where children used to play had almost dried up. The market where she sold fruits as a young woman had become crowded with strangers who did not know her story. She suddenly understood something painful. The world had continued to move forward for nearly 200 years, but her heart was still carrying people from long ago. She felt as though she belonged to another time and had accidentally remained alive while her entire generation disappeared. One evening, Amora returned to her mother's grave after many years. The old burial ground had become forgotten and covered with grass and wildflowers. Some of the stones had broken, and many names could no longer be read. She searched for a long time before finding the grave she had made with her own hands almost 2 centuries earlier. She knelt beside it and gently touched the stone. Then she realized something that frightened her deeply. She could no longer clearly remember her mother's face. She remembered her kindness and her voice, but the image of her face had become cloudy in her mind. Amora burst into tears because she understood that living too long was slowly stealing even her most precious memories. For many months after that night, Amora hardly spoke to anyone. She stayed inside her small house and filled pieces of cloth with names, dates, and memories of people she had loved. She wrote about her mother, the old chief, the little girl with the mango, and the traveler who had become an old man. She feared that if she did not write everything down, the memories would fade one by one until she remembered nothing at all. Every evening she read those writings aloud to herself, trying to keep the faces of the dead alive inside her heart. Yet each time she finished reading, she felt even lonelier because she realized she was the only person in the world who still remembered them. As the years passed, people continued to hear stories about the woman who never grew old. Travelers came from distant places to look at her, ask questions, and listen to her stories. Some believed she carried a secret that could make people live forever. Others simply wanted to see whether the stories were true. They looked at her with wonder and admiration, but nobody understood the heavy sadness hidden behind her calm face. Many people wished for a life as long as hers, yet if they had spent one day carrying her loneliness, they might have begged for an ordinary life instead. Every visitor eventually left, and every goodbye made her house feel emptier than before. One rainy night, while listening to the sound of water falling on her roof, Amora counted the years she had lived and realized she was almost 200 years old. The thought made her hands tremble. She had lived longer than anyone she had ever known, longer than the memories of entire generations, and still there was no sign that her life was nearing its end. She lay awake until morning, staring at the ceiling and asking herself a question that filled her with fear. If 200 years had already passed and she had not changed at all, how many more years still waited for her? Another 100? Another 200? Or would she remain here forever, watching the world change again and again while she stayed exactly the same young woman she had always been? The morning after that sleepless night, Amara left her house before sunrise and walked through the quiet town. The sky was still dark, and only a few birds had begun to sing. She carried the cloth pieces on which she had written the memories of everyone she had loved. She sat beneath the same old tree where the little girl had once shared a mango with her and began reading every name aloud. As she spoke, tears rolled down her face because she realized something terrible. The people in those memories felt more real to her than the people living around her now. The past had become her true home, while the present felt like a place she was only passing through. She wondered how many more names she would have to add before her heart became too heavy to carry another goodbye. As the sun slowly rose, a small boy passed by and noticed her tears. He sat beside her and asked why she looked so sad. Amara smiled gently and said she missed some old friends. The boy laughed and replied that if she missed them, she should simply visit them. His innocent answer almost made her smile again. Then he asked her age. Amara stayed silent because she no longer knew how to answer that question. The boy guessed 20 years old and smiled proudly. At that moment, Amara felt a deep pain in her chest. Nearly 200 years had passed, and she still looked like a young woman beginning her life. The boy soon ran away to play, but his simple words stayed with her for the rest of the day. That evening, Amara returned to her house and opened a wooden box that had belonged to her mother. Inside were a few old clothes, a small cooking spoon, and a piece of cloth her mother had once used to wrap fruit. She held those things carefully in her hands because they were the only objects left from the woman who had raised her. Suddenly she realized that even these things looked older than she did. The cloth was worn, the spoon had become dull, and the wooden box was cracked with age, yet her face remained untouched by time. For a long while she stared at her reflection in a bowl of water and whispered that she no longer understood who she was. She looked young, but inside she felt older than the oldest tree in the town. During the following months, Amara began writing down every memory she still possessed. She wrote until late at night and continued again at sunrise. She feared forgetting the people she loved more than she feared death itself. Sometimes she woke suddenly from sleep because she could no longer remember the face of someone important to her. Then she would search through her writings and read every line again. Slowly, her house filled with pieces of cloth covered in names and stories. The walls, the floor, and even small baskets became crowded with memories. Anyone entering the house would have thought it belonged to many people, but in truth it belonged to one lonely woman trying desperately to keep the past from disappearing forever. One stormy night, strong wind entered through the windows and scattered the cloth pieces across the room. Amara rushed to gather them, terrified that she might lose even one memory. She fell to her knees and held the writings against her chest while tears streamed down her face. In that moment she understood something shocking. She was no longer afraid of growing old or even of dying. What truly frightened her was the thought of forgetting the people who had loved her. If she lost those memories, then it would be as though they had never existed at all. As the rain continued outside, Amara made herself a promise. She would spend the rest of her long life protecting every memory she still carried, because memories were now the only family she had left. Decades continued to pass over the town like changing seasons, and Amara remained exactly the same. Children were born, became adults, and later grew old while she still carried the face of a young woman. Entire streets changed, old houses disappeared, and new buildings rose in their place. The river beside which she had played as a child became smaller, and many of the great trees from her youth were gone. Sometimes Amara would stand in the middle of the town and suddenly feel frightened because nothing around her looked familiar anymore. It was as if she had walked into the life of strangers. She carried hundreds of memories inside her heart, but there was no one left alive to share those memories with her. She had become a living reminder of a world that no longer existed. One evening, while arranging the cloth pieces on which she had written her memories, Amara noticed that her hands were trembling. At first she thought she was tired, but then she realized the trembling came from fear. She had lived for so long that she no longer knew how many years had passed. She began counting carefully, using old events and the names she had written down. When she finally finished, she sat completely still. Nearly 300 years had gone by since the day she was born. 300 years of watching faces appear and disappear. 300 years of saying goodbye. 300 years of carrying grief that no human heart was meant to hold. The number felt so large that she could hardly believe it belonged to her life. That night, Amara could not sleep. She sat outside her house and looked at the stars above her. She tried to imagine everything that had happened during those 3 centuries. She remembered the sound of her mother's laughter, the old chief's gentle advice, the little girl's smile as she offered her a mango, and the old traveler's final words. Then she realized something so painful that tears filled her eyes. Every person who had ever loved her was gone. Not one remained. Not a single hand that had once held hers still existed in the world. She felt more alone than she had ever felt before. The silence around her seemed endless, and for the first time in many years she wished she could simply close her eyes and rest beside the people she missed. As dawn approached, Amara walked once more to the old burial ground. Many graves had disappeared beneath grass and time, and some stones had broken into pieces. She stood there for hours, moving slowly from one grave to another, even though she no longer knew exactly where some of her loved ones rested. The world had forgotten them, but she had not. She spoke their names softly into the morning air and thanked them for the moments they had shared with her. Then she sat on the ground and cried until the sun rose high above the trees. She cried for her mother, for her friends, for every child she had watched grow old, and for herself, because she had carried all those losses alone. When she returned home that evening, Amara opened her wooden box of memories and carefully placed all the cloth writings inside. Then she lit a small lamp and sat beside it for many hours. She had now lived for 300 years, yet she still looked exactly as she had looked at 20. Her hair was still dark, her face still smooth, and her eyes still young, but inside she felt older than time itself. She whispered to herself that perhaps the saddest thing about living so long was not staying young forever. The saddest thing was watching the entire world keep moving while every person you love becomes only a memory. As the lamp flickered beside her, Amara closed her eyes and held the box against her chest, afraid that one day even her memories might finally fade into silence. The morning after that long and painful night, Amara woke up with the wooden box still resting in her arms. The small lamp had burned out, and sunlight was entering through the window. For a long time she remained seated on the floor, staring at the dust floating in the air. She suddenly realized that she had spent almost 300 years remembering people who were gone and mourning a world that no longer existed. She stood slowly and looked at her reflection in a bowl of water. The same young face looked back at her, untouched by time, untouched by sorrow. Yet behind those eyes lived 3 centuries of memories. She wondered how many more years those eyes would have to see and whether there would ever come a day when they would finally close forever. Later that day, children were playing outside her house and laughing loudly. Their voices reminded Amara of the children she had known hundreds of years earlier. She stepped outside and watched them for a long time. One little girl smiled at her, and for a brief moment she saw the face of the child who had once shared a mango with her. The memory struck her heart so suddenly that tears filled her eyes. The little girl asked why she was crying, and Amara simply smiled and said that someone long ago had once smiled in exactly the same way. The child did not understand, but she held Amara's hand for a few seconds before running away. Those few seconds stayed with Amara for the rest of the day. That night, Amara opened her box of memories once again and began reading every cloth piece she had written over the centuries. Some of the cloths were so old that they had become fragile. She read the names one after another and tried to remember every face. Some memories came easily, while others had become faint and distant. She suddenly became frightened because she realized that even memories have their own kind of old age. They slowly fade, lose their colors, and become harder to hold on to. She pressed the cloths against her chest and promised herself that she would continue speaking the names of those she loved so that they would never completely disappear. As the months passed, people from many distant places continued coming to see the woman who had never grown old. Some believed she carried a hidden answer to long life. Others simply wished to look upon someone who had seen 3 centuries pass by. They asked her endless questions. What was the world like long ago? What had changed? What had remained the same? Amara answered kindly, but she never spoke about her deepest sadness. She never told them that there were days when she could not bear the weight of her memories. She never told them that every smile they saw on her face had been shaped by countless goodbyes. One evening, after all the visitors had gone, Amara walked to the river where her mother had once washed clothes. The river was smaller now and flowed more quietly than before. She sat on the same old stone and listened to the water moving through the darkness. Then she whispered every name she could still remember, one after another, until tears rolled down her face. When she finally finished, she realized that she was speaking to people who had been gone for hundreds of years. Yet to her, they still felt close, as if they had only left yesterday. She looked up at the night sky and wondered if carrying memories for so long was the reason her heart felt older than the world around her. The next morning, Amara returned to the river before the sun had fully risen. A thick mist floated above the water, and the entire place was silent except for the soft sound of birds waking in the trees. She sat on the old stone and looked at her reflection in the river. The same young face stared back at her, unchanged after 300 years. She touched her cheeks and slowly closed her eyes. Then a painful thought entered her mind. She had spent so many years remembering people who had left this world that she had almost forgotten herself. She could remember her mother's smile, the old chief's voice, and the little girl's laughter, but she could barely remember what kind of dreams she had once carried as a young woman. Had she wanted to travel? Had she wished to have a family? Had she hoped for children of her own? Time had taken those answers from her. For the first time in centuries, Amara cried not for the people she had lost but for the young woman she used to be, because somewhere during those 300 years, she too had slowly become a memory. See you in next episode.